Aloha! Thank you all so much for joining us today in mourning the victims of the Atlanta Massacre, standing in solidarity against racial, sexual, and colonial violence. My name is Sarah Julia Escobedo Bradenstein. I'm a multi-ethnic Yonsei Nikkei with family ties to Oakland, Seattle, and Hawaii. The violence towards Asian women's bodies breaks my heart and brings up complex emotions of sadness, anger, and concern for the safety of my family and community. This is not a new problem, and we all must come together to dismantle white supremacy. My great-grandmother, Tomiko, was raising her family in Nihonjimachi when Executive Order 9066 was issued in 1942. She gave birth to her 8th child just weeks before she packed her suitcase full of diapers, outfits for each child, and a handful of baby photos. My family was incarcerated in Tanforan Rehabilitation Center before being sent to the concentration camp in Topaz, Utah. My family's experiences surviving incarceration and white supremacy has rippled through our generations. As a descendant of concentration camp survivors, I feel that we have moral responsibilities to stand in solidarity with communities being targeted and marginalized. 1 year ago, I started a small group at the University of Hawaii to create a space for healing and start conversations in Hawaii addressing racism, misogyny, colonialism, and white supremacy. Our group has now grown to over 250 people from around the world. We are so grateful for each of you for joining us in our first live stream event. I would like to thank all of our panelists for joining us today, and I'm so grateful for Mapu Kyle, Kimiko, and Japanese American Memorial Pilgrimages for helping to organize this event. I want to acknowledge that this event is based in the lawfully occupied nation of Hawaii. We feel it is important to begin this event by centering Kanaka Maoli voices and perspectives. I'm so excited to introduce Maile Naehu. Maile is a Kanaka Maoli Boricua educator, performer, artist, and community organizer and activist of Aloha Aina from the island of Molokai, Hawaii. She is also the director of the Molokai Nui Ahina Project, a multi-generational community art project that is founded in traditional storytelling. Maile applies indigenous philosophies and practices such as mo'olelo, oral tradition, olelo Hawaii, Hawaiian language, hula, dance, and oli, chant to her teachings. Through teaching storytelling via various art mediums, she emphasizes great importance in building communication skills, self-confidence, and a new generation of storytellers. She strongly believes that ancient wisdoms within the stories of our ancestors hold the answer to modern-day problems. As a cultural practitioner, she has represented Hawaii as a delegate, a presenter, and as a consultant for both national and international gatherings and conferences in education in the arts. Together, Maile and her husband Hano share the hip-hop stage as the Paniolo Prince and his queen Maile. Please join me in welcoming Maile. Aloha. Icholo Maile. Can you hear me? I'm sorry. Um, I'm sorry. Can we please unmute you? We missed your beautiful Oli. Kalamai. Oh, will you see the unmute button at the bottom part of your screen?
There, can you hear me now?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh my gosh, Kalamai.
Okay. Kalamai, thank you.
Aloha mai kako. I'm so honored to be here with all of you. I'd like to open up with an Oli Aloha. Oh, now, naika halame kale hua, he halale hua no yanaka no. Oh, kaunoya, ano ine. Eli ane o yo kahikima, hikima no. Hiki puno me ke aloha. Aloha e. Aloha e. Aloha e. Mahalo. I would also like to quickly follow with a poem, a mele that I wrote about my story and the story of my three keiki and of my ancestors. I echo the visions of my ancestors, a child of Chinese, Portuguese, Spanish, Taino, African, Hawaiian, Scottish, and Irish ancestors. I appear to most of the world as just white. Been told I'm not white enough to be white by white people, but I'm not brown enough to be brown by brown people. And have had several uncomfortable moments when I share my Chang family origins with other Asians. They don't believe I could possibly share a heritage even remotely like theirs because we look different. Difference. My life has been a surreal experience of white privilege, a blessing and a curse. The double-bladed sword now, it's my sharpest weapon. I have been told my son wouldn't be able to handle an English-speaking private school. He is a manaleo. His first language is Olelo Hawaii. He graduated as valedictorian and is now a composer of music. I have been told that I should feel sorry that my daughter has a Filipino nose, yet she is all the beauty in the world that I have ever dreamed of. I have been yelled at and told I am not who I am, who my ancestors are, and felt as though I needed to prove and earn my place. Fearful, sad souls will not destroy me or my children. Yes, racism is so real. Yes, prejudice is so real. Yes, discrimination is so real. All too real. I have been on the receiving end of both, but regardless, all I have been through still allows me to step into the world of white privilege and to be more accepted. Perhaps serving as an invisibility cloak to step inside places that people like my children may not be accepted into. I worry because my keiki do not look like me. You might wonder, why would a mother say something like that? They, my babies, are undoubtedly of color, many colors. All colors flow through their veins. I love every inch of their beautiful selves, their Asian eyes, their dark chocolate hair, and their many colors. But others don't love it so much, and this makes my heart heavy. I want them to be seen as I see them, but others don't see that. So I teach my children to be true, to be honorable, to be proud descendants of their divine ancestors who saw no boundaries and fell deeply in love with each other's souls, creating them, creating me, creating us. So I keep my worries quiet and to myself, never telling them about my worries, the worry and fear of racist hatred, colorblind fools. I will fiercely protect them, their story, a story that will continue to get more and more colorful with each generation. I am raising warriors of love, warriors of aloha, rainbow children, rising. Mahalo nui.
Mahalo e kumu Maile. Velina mai kako, and welcome to Mourning the Victims of the Atlanta Massacre, standing in solidarity against racial, sexual, and colonial violence. My name is Dr. Mapuana Paia A'ala Shizuko Hayashi-Simpliciano. It's my pleasure to be with you today as the moderator of this event. I'm going to read over the objectives of the event and get into the backgrounds of our panelists. I'm sure you're anxious to hear them, and once you hear their backgrounds, you'll understand why we invited them to be on the panel today. So our objectives for this event are to express solidarity with those under this umbrella term of Asian Americans facing racist violence. Today, we grieve and process the event emotionally and politically as a community so we can better support each other through this tragedy of the shootings that happened in Atlanta. We hope to develop a better historical understanding of the killings and to begin conversations about the work to be done. Today, we center the direct victims, but acknowledge that we are affected by the tragedies in differential ways based off of historical circumstances and positionalities. We are coming together to affirm the need to dismantle the structures of oppression, the need to find points of intersection, and most importantly, today is about our need to hold each other during this time. Even if we are not directly impacted by this tragedy, we are certainly emotionally impacted by this tragedy. I would like to start by thanking Dr. Kyle Kajihiro for his initial suggestion to bring the community together. I celebrate you, Dr. Kajihiro, as a Japanese man who's willing to normalize standing up for Asian women and girls. So Dr. Kyle Kajihiro is a Japanese settler in Hawaii, living in Moile. He's a former labor organizer. He is active in demilitarization efforts in Hawaii and internationally through the organizations Hawaii Peace and Justice, Koa Futures, and Malama Makua. He lectures in ethnic studies and geography at the University of Hawaii at Manoa and is an ACLS Emerging Voices Fellow at the University of Wisconsin. We also have with us Teresa Folk. Teresa, her pronouns are she and her, Filipinx educator, writer, activist who has taught literature, public speaking, and women's studies for over 30 years. She is an accomplished writer who has been published in several publications and was a columnist for the Hawaii Women's Journal. Among her many accomplishments, Teresa states that she is a mother of 2 children, Rebecca Lourdes, 9, and Brand Duncan, who's 8. We also have Tom Huynh, who is the administrator for Asians Today on Facebook. He is the former vice president of the NAACP in Clayton County. He is a proud descendant of Vietnamese refugees and defines himself as an immigrant.
Not really. I'm more second generation. My family are immigrants, so my experience is going to be different from them.
Mahalo for that clarification. And the ways in which that we identify ourselves are very important, so mahalo for that correction. We have with us Dr. Celia Tagamolila Bardwell Jones, professor of philosophy at Hilo, Filipina settler. She teaches and researches ethics, critical race feminism, immigration, and women of color philosophies. She also teaches Indigenous political commitments and Asian settler responsibilities. I'd also like to welcome to the panel Naomi Masako Regan. Naomi is a new resident and settler to the Hawaiian Isles. Naomi is a student of the Hawaiian language and also very accomplished in her cultural exploration of Okinawan culture, language, and dance. She is an environmental advocate, as well as an advocate for teaching about Okinawan identity. And we also welcome to the panel Miss Willow Chang. Willow is committed to sacred process and learning experience and sacred practice through art. She is a lifelong singer and dancer. Her multidisciplined approaches has taken her to teach performance in from Hawaii to the US to Canada to Europe to Asia and to the Middle East. In addition to music and dance, Willow is a poet, MC, TV host, photographer, costume designer, and activist. Willow will help us process our feelings about this tragedy in song, in the memory of the victims of the shooting in Georgia. And if you stick around towards the end of the event, Willow is also going to close the event with a special Buto dance. Sorry, Willow, you might want to make sure you unmute as well.
Mahalo. Is it me now? Okay. And when a child is born into this world, it has no concept of the tone of skin I'm living in. This is an excerpt from a song called 7 Seconds. It was performed and written by Senegalese singer Youssou N'Dour and done as a duet with jazz singer and pop singer Nena Cherry. When I heard it for the first time when I was dancing in Egypt in 1994, it struck me as such a profound sentiment because being a mixed race person growing in Hawaii and being so far away from home, it addressed the very reality that all people of color experience. And at the heart of it, you can say we're all people of color, but the reality is also we live in a world that has a very different perception of how we define who's high on the food chain. I'm grateful for this opportunity to share with you my personal experiences. I would like to say in advance that this journey is one that is very complex, and there's always a lot to unpack, and I feel like it's our kuleana and our responsibility to do just that. I'm excited and invigorated by the conversations that are happening today about identity and the fluidity of identity, about the oppression of colonization, about rights for LGBTQI and every other disenfranchised group. I'm grateful that social media provides a platform where people can discuss freely about these things that are very difficult. I know the lenses and how I view things have changed greatly as the conversations have, and I'm grateful for every teacher who's imbued those outlooks to see things differently. One of the things I think people in Hawaii frequently like to say, and I don't want to negate someone's experience, but I can see the harm in this idea, which is I don't see color. This is said all the time. You read about it, people say it, and there's such, I think, a beautiful intention wrapped up in that message. I don't see color. But as long as we negate the reality that there are unique differences that we can celebrate and respect in everyone's background, I don't see color can be really an enabling action that allows the worst of humanity to occur. Another thing you'll hear is the idea, I can't be racist because, fill in the blank. They can't be racist because his husband's Mexican. I can't be racist because I grew up in Hawaii. I can't be racist because my coworker is Filipino. And the list goes on. But the reality is that each of us do have a responsibility to dig in deep and find out and root out what type of things that we have discrimination against. It's not an easy conversation to have with yourself. It is so much easier to sweep it under the rug. But if we want to have some meaningful impact, it's something we must do. I think of discrimination and racism kind of like cockroaches. Everyone in Hawaii has a relationship with roaches, whether they want to admit it or not, because we're in a subtropic climate and it's a fantastic place for roaches to take root. It doesn't suggest that your house is not clean, right? Everyone loves the hoi hoi. They're pretty effective. But the reality is that when you see one cockroach, the math usually is, and I've heard, one roach equals 100 hiding somewhere else. I think of discrimination and racism to really kind of be the same. One incident that we experience is really a sign of 100 other events that are hiding and that are beneath the surface. It's a terrifying thought. It's a terrifying reality. But if we're honest with ourselves, we understand what needs to be done. Another thing that I think enables the situation of systemic racism culturally is this idea of don't rock the boat. Being half Chinese myself and growing up in Hawaii, these two tropes and ideas, they really were kind of the North Star for a lot of things. And I would rock the boat as an artist with funny haircuts, with speaking my mind, with liking things that were different from the crowd. I already knew that as a mixed race person, my sheer existence already rocked the boat. So I figured I didn't really have a lot to lose per se. Don't rock the boat and the idea of not bringing shame to your family, again, might have a beautiful intention to want to provide and maintain the integrity of your family or your work or your job. I understand that there are circumstances that if you're disenfranchised, you may not have the upper hand and you may not have the abilities to speak your mind. But we need to find ways to slowly, in small ways that are mighty, dismantle this. One of my favorite memes that I've seen, it was spray painted on the side of an abandoned house. It says, speak your truth even if your voice shakes. Part of my voice is shaking on the inside because I know it's far easier for people to think that an artist who's female and seems to like the spotlight, you are then subjugated to just be pretty and entertain and make nice. But you know what? Every artist and every individual here has something to say that is meaningful, and each of us must speak our truth, even if it rocks the boat. I do have notes here. It's essential for us to find truth, and truth can be cloaked in many different garments. And sometimes there are false truths, and there are things that we were taught and we grew up with that we were told are truths. And that might have even been truthful for that time. But we also have to understand that realizing something is part of a cultural milieu is not an excuse to continue abuses into the future and the now. I think we also need to know that it's essential that we can't do it alone. It is so important for us to work together. It's so important to set aside old grievances that might have been passed down from generation to generation, whether it's the idea that the Chinese don't like the Japanese or X, Y, and Z. I think it's time for us to put all of that to rest. It's not going to help us advance the cause of deeper understanding and a more harmonious existence of coexisting. I know I've spoken a lot, but I'd like to close this segment with just sharing a poem. It's something that I wrote with reflection to my family of origin. So it's called Hypergamy and the Sojourn of Sighs. My father's family came from merchant class, sailed across the ocean from China, Gung first, later Popo, and the trip from Canton to Hawaii could not have been easy. These Changs, these grandparents, they were long gone before me, so I could never ask them face to face in a most un-Chinese way the millions of whys I entertain on a leisurely day of repose or after leaving flowers and incense on their headstones. They sold dry goods to those who worked the fields in Honolulu. The crops of pineapple and sugar were far sweeter than the aching work required to produce the bounty for a global sweet tooth. I wonder if people knew the work that went into pineapple harvesting, if they would have still associated it as a gift of hospitality. These army of workers clothed in dungarees reworked yukata, a cloth of Hawaiian plaid called palaka, erasing old identity and replaced with clothes that served a function. The diaspora of the Chinese, the Portuguese, the Japanese, Koreans, and finally Filipinos, thousands and thousands of miles away in a new Aina, each had to find how to bridge the journey of the human heart with so many different dialects. I think of the night sky, then how many stars one must have seen from anywhere. You wouldn't have to drive all the way from light pollution, and perhaps then knew more stars by name and sight than just the Big Dipper, the North Star, or Sirius. How many looked up and wondered, why am I here? Will I ever return? Is Hawaii my home? My father's family came from merchant class. They were never coolies. They never did other people's laundry. They never opened a restaurant. They owned property, and they sent every child to college, including the girls. And my grandmother never learned English. She never felt the need. Perhaps she believed Hawaii was simply a small sojourn, and she'd maybe one day return back to China, back to Canton, back to the south, to the village of Hotao. Instead, she walked Honolulu pavement on tiny feet, the remnants of hoped-for hypergamy, that these bound feet, the lotus blossom of a foot, would attract a better suitor. These tiny feet, made small, but today proclaimed deformed, dealt with the effects of 13 pregnancies. I try to imagine the swelling she surely endured and shudder. She walked each day on tiny feet on the roads that married downtown to Chinatown and Nu'uanu, and visited the Kuan Yin temple. What did she chant for? What compassion did she seek? Was it gold-colored walls or red waxy candles aglow? Was it the invitation of abundance, fresh oranges stacked on ceramic plates and placed in pyramid form? Or was it Kuan Yin, smiling, Asian Mona Lisa? Perhaps it simply was a moment to retreat from the demands of King Street or the gossip of Pake Hollywood. I have heard these stories of people whose DNA I share, whose surname I still know how to write in measured calligraphic form, relatives whose tiny wrists I also have that reveal my Chinese lineage. These stories of family are in bits and pieces, shared in fits and spurts. They are more mythology now than anything. I know my grandfather was a good businessman, but was it due to timing or acumen? Was he wise or an opportunist? Was he shrewd? Was he fair? I hope so. Clearly, he had fire in the belly. He figured out how to make it work. But I am unsure if this trait is passed on in the bloodline like a small wrist. Gung Gung was a Taoist, and when I learned of this, it all made sense. Quote, the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. Close quote. Did he take comfort in the idea for some, reality for others, that it is what it is? The very mantra my own father said often when he felt moved to speak. Or did he find the light in the pages of the Tao as I do, reading first and later knowing, quote, mystery and manifestations arise from the same source. This source is called darkness, darkness within darkness, the gateway to all understanding. Thank you.
Mahalo, Willow. So a lot of really powerful words and statements. We're going to jump right in now to the panel. I know seeing this tragedy about the Atlanta massacre in the headlines has impacted all of us deeply. I want to beam in right now to Naomi and Tom. They are new residents or fairly new residents to the Hawaiian Isles that were actually have a history of being raised down south and being raised in that area. So Tom, you're actually from Atlanta, Georgia. What were your initial reactions when you heard the headlines?
In all bluntness, I'm not surprised, but surprised at when it occurred, because Georgia is white power haven. I'll get more into it, where a lot of innocent Black people are killed and a lot of hate groups are there. So for an Asian person to make headlines at this point was a surprise, because as I said before, it's not a matter of if, a matter of when.
Naomi, what was your reactions?
Yeah, so maybe in some ways, like Tom said, I was not entirely surprised either. To be honest, so I'm still processing what I have been feeling from it. I've been vacillating between focusing on things related to community spaces that were happening regardless of what happened this week, and pouring myself into that, because the moments in between, I don't have yet words. It's mostly been tears and trying to, support friends and family who are still in the deep south there, which is very, very different from what is happening here in Hawaii. So I am like going back and forth in the processing how different it is to be here, and the fears and trauma, not only of this week, but what that is connected to in just being there at any point in where we are in our histories. So not surprised, but.
So Dr. Kajihiro, you bring kind of that Hawaii diaspora perspective to this conversation. Reading these headlines, what were your initial reactions?
Let me unmute myself first and say thanks to Mapuana and Sarah and Kimiko and the Japanese American Memorial Pilgrimages and Tsuru for Solidarity for creating this space for us to have this conversation and help us process. I wonder if we could just take a moment to recognize the lives that were lost and have a moment of reflection on silence for them. And I'm sorry if I don't pronounce these names correctly, but I'm going to try my best. Hyun Jung Grant, Dao Yu Fang, Sun Cha Kim, Paul Andre Michaels, Sun Chung Park, Xiao Jie Tan, Delina Ashley Yan, Young A Yu. Thank you. So I guess my initial reaction was shock, then sorrow, and then anger. I think I'm still in the anger mode. And I kind of cycle through these different feelings about what's happening. Even though we're an ocean and a continent away, the shockwaves shook us here. And I think that's why it was important for us to have this conversation. So thanks for reaching out, Mapuana and Sarah, and trying to figure out like what is where do we fit into this story, because we have this. And I think one of the things for at least for me, and I'm guilty of this, is that people in Hawaii sometimes feel that we're in an exceptional situation, that because there's a lot of Asians we're not affected by the same kinds of intense racism and hatred that others are experiencing. But and we'll talk about this more later, but there is a long history of anti-Asian violence here. And we are also affected in different ways. So I guess I'll leave that there where my initial reactions were, but thank you.
Mahalo. And you know, for the viewers that might be watching, we had kind of had planned to take a moment of silence in the beginning artistically, and that didn't happen. And I am deeply, deeply touched by the loss of lives that have been stolen from us, but also that, you know, Dr. Kajihiro, in the moment, spontaneous, knew that this is something that had to happen, and he took that responsibility to remember these Asian women and these victims. So thank you so much, Dr. Kajihiro. That takes a lot of strength to do that. And I really, again, have to thank Dr. Kajihiro and Tom for stepping up and sitting with these women. You know, so many of us reading these headlines feel this heartache. And I could just sense, reading Teresa's posts on social media, that these headlines hit her heavy as well. Teresa, do you feel like sharing about, you know, how these headlines have impacted you?
Sure. Thank you so much, Mapuana, and everybody else. As she shared, I've been an educator for 30 years now. So when something like this happens, my first instinct is lesson plan. What am I going to do? My classroom and my students are the way that I fight this fight. And Kyle, as you were reading those names, you know, I think I've had students with each of those surnames, maybe more than once. And so when I see those faces and I hear those names, I see all of the children who have been through my classrooms since 1991. And so for me, I wasn't surprised either at all. I mean, honestly, I wondered why it took that long. And then the first thing that I did was sit down and talk about to myself, and I still haven't figured it out, you know, how am I going to address this with my juniors and seniors in my women in literature class, which is really a gender studies class? How will I address it with my 8th graders who just finished reading To Kill a Mockingbird? How will I address it with my 7th grade homeroom? Because no matter what age, all of this starts early. It starts from the moment that we begin to speak. It starts from the words that we teach our children. And it starts from, you know, all of those moments. One of the things I did say to my students, my juniors and seniors, was, you know, and I teach them intersectionality and hypermasculinity and diaspora. They know all of those words. And one of the things that we talked about the other day was, you know, all of this starts with the language that you use for one another under the benches, you know, or at the benches of the senior tables, or what have you. So for me, you know, I also, and then I'll give this over, I know there are a lot of people here, but I have 2 beautiful adopted children. My son is blonde and blue-eyed. My daughter is a beautiful Filipina, dark-haired, dark-eyed girl. And I live every day knowing that the 2 of them stand in a lot of ways at opposite ends of the spectrum of privilege in this country. And I think, how do I raise them? How do I teach them to be good to one another and to be global citizens so that all of this doesn't happen again? So, you know, the event itself was, you know, absolutely horrifying to me. And I've read many different accounts of it. And my first instinct was, how do I get in the classroom? And I fight it. And that's what I will continue to do.
Thank you. Dr. Bardwell Jones, you know, you're such a busy woman, and yet you volunteered your time to be here today to grieve with us. Can you tell us how these headlines, have impacted you?
Mahalo for inviting me. Salamat po for inviting me. I'm deeply honored to mourn with the group here. I've been sorting out a lot of these emotions as well, and as an educator at UH Hilo, I teach courses also in women of color philosophies and and gender and feminism and race especially, and I just kept thinking how the sexualization of Asian women's bodies, and I know this was the first thing that popped into me, was just like, how did the sexualization of Asian women's bodies become the site of violence that we're seeing now? And it reminded me, because I grew up in California as well, of the Isla Vista shootings, in California in 2014, and incels, right? This is the involuntary celibates, right? And I've been teaching work from a feminist philosopher named Kate Mann, and she writes this book called The Logic of Misogyny. And to me, I just kept thinking of misogyny. How does this apply in this context? And for Kate Mann, she argues that misogyny, a naive form of misogyny, is understood as like individual, almost a psychological hatred towards women, right? But the way that that's just the naive form of misogyny. The more nuanced form of misogyny that we're seeing nowadays is that it's a kind of hatred of particular women and bodies that threaten sexually. And note how this term of threatening comes into play here. And so my initial reaction when I saw this was that there was this denial of race that happened, and again, it further perpetuated the silencing of Asian women and Asian American communities' outrage and concerns. And to me, that's where I feel this. There's so much to unpack, and I'll say more about my thoughts later. But misogyny and hostility is escalated. That's really damaging to me. It really hurts me, and I mourn because of these kinds of systems of violence, sexual violence that has occurred.
Mahalo. When I hear Dr. Bardwell Jones use this term misogyny, I also heard that theme in Willow's poetic performance. I know you touched upon this in your poetry, Willow, but just really briefly, really quickly, we're going to ask Dr. Kajihiro and Dr. Bardwell Jones to historicize this tragedy in the context of Hawaii. But before we get into that, I just kind of wanted to quickly get your thoughts.
I share many of the same sentiments expressed previously, and respecting that it's still very fresh. Of course, there's shock, right? Everyone feels shock, and of course you feel sorrow, and you place it in the context, surnames, students, the realization that all of these families will be impacted for generations because of this violent act. But because I'm in a place in my personal life where I'm giving myself permission to feel anger, because I don't feel like I was ever allowed that luxury. I think that's a lot to do with the way I was raised. It's a survival tactic, and it's something that women in Asian cultures, I think, unfortunately, they promote, and we embody that because we are rewarded for being that way. However, anger, when it's expressed in a safe, healthy, and constructive way, is absolutely necessary for healing. I don't think that you can have healing from a transgression without allowing yourself to feel anger. So it's an interesting experience to give myself space to feel that, and to speak my mind. And a lot of these things, because as Ms. Falk said, she's read a lot of news sources, and I do the same. I'm sometimes prone to doom scrolling, and I like to read many resources to try to piece together a picture that might be eliminated by just a single or two news sources. And it's surprising to me how frequently the massage parlor now is equated to sex. And I'm going to profess that I must be very naive, because when I see those storefronts, I know there's all different kinds of businesses that exist, but I don't associate it, because I have many friends and colleagues in the healing arts. I don't make the beeline to assume that someone who is a massage therapist is a sex worker. And even if they are, I'm trying to condition myself to understand that a sex worker is just another form of employment. It may not be one that I choose, but I understand collectively that people in the healing arts, people in the arts, women, people of Asian descent, there's this intersectionality, this Venn diagram where everyone is in the crosshairs. And that's something I think that's important, because I know in my profession as a singer, as a dancer, there's a lot of things that you have to contend with that are not by choice, but they almost go with the territory. You have no say. I know that when I worked professionally in Egypt, and I was just thinking about this when you guys were discussing it, so forgive me, I'm a little emotional, but I had an apartment. I was working later as a singer, and I had some friends move furniture for me because I did not have the ability to move them. They were old, heavy pieces with marble, and there's just little me. So I had friends over who are male. They helped me move the furniture. And my manager said, I heard that you had guys over at your house. This is like 11 o'clock in the afternoon. So I heard you had guys over at your house. I said, yes, I had some people move furniture because I couldn't move the furniture myself. He said, well, the singer here before you was German, and she was, doing things she shouldn't, and she was decapitated. And if this happens to you, it's not our responsibility. I will say within a week, I left. I left the country because to me, I didn't think it was worth singing in a foreign country to risk my life with people who had no interest in maintaining my health or my safety. And although that might be just a one-off and a personal experience, I know that that's something that people around the world who are female performers experience on a regular daily basis. So I think it's just like really shocking. And I think what's really scary is that people think, well, if you're a massage worker, then you must be a sex worker. If you're a sex worker, then therefore you deserved it. It's okay. You can be snuffed out because you're those kinds of people. And I think that that is something that really needs to be discussed as well. It's frightening.
Yeah. And, I actually am very surprised on my own personal feed of friends and, relatives that are Japanese American men that come from picture brides, that come from this history in our islands, having these judgments on the headlines, like immediately after, with no real solid information about what's happened. So I'm hearing Naomi and Tom and Teresa speak to this present, this current reality of this violence on Asian bodies and Asian women, and Willow speaking to this this threat that Asian women feel globally. I'd like to kind of historicize that a little bit. So, Dr. Kajihiro, can you give us some context about this kind of fear for on the bodies of the Asian community in the Pacific context and in the Hawaii context?
Sure. Well, it's a long history. I'm just going to run down a few things that I think mark the history of anti-Asian sentiment and violence. And if you look at like the history of Hawaii, when the Bayonet Constitution was forced on King Kalakaua in 1887, right? One of the provisions was to exclude a whole class of Asian immigrant workers from having any rights. So this is timed to coincide with the Chinese Exclusion Act that was in force in the United States, right? The anti-Chinese sort of lynchings and riots that were going on. And then, fast forward to the 1920s when Japanese in Hawaii were organizing and Filipinos were organizing on the plantations. There was a huge anti-Japanese movement. And this also coincides with the Massey Kahahawai incident, as well as the Fukunaga case where Miles Fukunaga killed the child of a prominent banker in Hawaii. And so Japanese in Hawaii were seen as the kind of threat, the yellow peril, and plans were being made to control this menace, such that after the Massey incident, plans were made for military government, and those came to fruition with martial law after World War II, right? And those same sort of imaginings influenced the concentration camps of Japanese Americans on the continent. So there's a kind of a rebound effect that's going on between Hawaii as a colony and the United States, and how Asian bodies are being racialized, and how power is being applied to us in these different forms. And then, I think if you look at the Japanese American, or Japanese in Hawaii's case, for in particular, there's a kind of a carrot and stick going on. So on one hand, we're yellow peril, we're a threat. On the other hand, after World War II, the 442nd is valorized as these kind of war heroes and patriots. And so we get rehabilitated back into U.S. society by being the war heroes. And so then the carrot and stick is that, if you continue to be resistant, you're the enemy alien, you deserve the camps. But if you're a hero, you can become a senator, you can become a governor, you can ascend. And that's a cruel trick that gets played on our communities all the time, with yellow peril and model minority, sort of playing off each other as a dynamic, right? And so we see the same thing happening with the current episodes of anti-Asian violence. How it gets framed as, on the one hand, Asians are privileged, and so and undeservingly so. On the other hand, right, it's a kind of a threat that's bringing disease and vice and all this kind of stuff. The same tropes that were happening back in the earlier periods of Asian immigration. The other thing I just want to add is just how the geopolitics also have an effect on the way that Asians in the United States are racialized. So Spanish-American War and the Philippine-American War, and how Filipinos get racialized in that context. World War II and Japanese Americans, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War. At every moment along this way, new epithets are emerge, right? And those words, like Willow was saying, they're not just words. They carry the force of history. They carry the violence that those words can enact, right? Those words can dehumanize classes of people, which make possible the kind of violence that we saw. And I guess the other point I want to add is just how I've been uncomfortable with the use of hate crime or hate as a way of describing what happened, because you see them debating in the news about whether or not this was an act of hate, or if he said it was about sexual addiction, then how could it be about hatred of Asians? Hatred implies that there's some kind of passionate, animosity towards a particular group, and it doesn't have to be that, right? You think about how the Nazis dispassionately exterminated genocided whole groups of people. Its system and the way that it can dehumanize people, that's where the real violence is embedded, that enables someone to just go in there and shoot them because they made him feel excited sexually, right? I mean, there's something weird about that whole thing, and so it's embedded in the power relations. But I'll stop there, and because I'm rambling. But thank you.
No, not at all. All of the information that you shared to historicize this this context of this extreme violence in Atlanta, Georgia, on these innocent people, it's important, I think, for especially the Nikkei community to have this context of what has happened in Hawaii. Often I talk with my Filipino friends who feel like now, currently in Hawaii, where Japanese have attained political power in status, that their narrative is getting squashed and lost. So Dr. Bardwell Jones, can you share with us what from the Filipino history we need to really know and hear and listen to in regards to how this violence can be historicized?
Mahalo nui. I wanted to focus, like, I like the history that you provided, Dr. Kajihiro. I wanted to focus on a couple of main parts of history, I think, related to immigration that affected women, particularly Asian women in particular, to kind of add to the history of what we're seeing here as a connection to the sexualization of violence on Asian women's bodies. And Filipinos do play a role here. There's a lot of Filipino history that I've been reading about related to, developing colonial mentalities that have affected the immigration, or how those that have immigrated to the United States have adopted a kind of colonial mindset of and then bringing it to Hawaii and also into the mainland. And again, I wanted to think about the history of colonization in Hawaii, as well as of U.S. colonization in the Philippines, more globally, to understand what I'm thinking that's going on here is the type of racist misogyny that we are seeing here in Atlanta. And I think it's important, the power to name, the power to diagnose, the power to put things in words, even if it isn't articulate quite yet, right? Because that's what we're doing here to help more in the process, right? Part of this process is the power to define, the power to name. And so one of the pieces of history that I think helps us think about to help us define this current moment is, and I'm sure you remember this, the Gentleman's Agreement of 1907, right? This prohibited immigration of Japanese immigrants to the United States. But there, of course, was a loophole, right? There was a loophole in that act. And that loophole allowed Japanese laborers to bring wives to Hawaii, right? So again, how women's bodies were kind of linked to their process of immigration in Hawaii. So that's where picture brides come in, right? That the movement of Asian women's bodies were predicated on, again, sexual access, or a kind of relationship to their bodies, right? Sexualized bodies. The second one which is more contemporary, but I think this all relates historically, is in more contemporary times, the rise of mail order brides, and that this contemporary industry that capitalizes on Asian women's bodies again, right? So there's a relationship of how we can see the ways in which Asian women's bodies immigrate, right? Travel, transnationally, right? And then the third moment is how labor, particularly Asian women's labor, right, and gets understood within the context of immigration. And so we, as Dr. Kajihiro stated, the Chinese Exclusion Act, there was the 1917 Asiatic Barred Zone Act that basically stopped all Asian immigration at all from coming to the United States. And then there's the Immigration Act of 1924. But note, I just wanted to say that Filipinos, for instance, were considered U.S. nationals, right? And so their immigration status was different because they were seen as an exception. They were given an exception to be seen as U.S. nationals, but were still subject to a U.S. racist state. So Yenli Espiritu calls it differential inclusion. Sorry, I have to think about that more. So Filipinos were, kind of brought in as U.S. nationals, but still suffered the yoke of U.S. racism in the state, colonial state. And then moreover, there were exceptions to Asians immigrating to Hawaii, which was considered a territory, right? So note how, these acts, tended to exclude Asians in the mainland, but there were different ways in which other types of Asians, right, were able to immigrate on that level. And that I wanted to also say that during the whole, when we're thinking about labor, is the history of how the Asian women's occupational opportunities were only open to certain types of jobs, certain types of service work, right? And I'm not gonna, and when you think about the historical context, right, of Asian women, right, being how they were understood, their bodies were understood in the process of immigration, that their opportunities to find meaningful work were severely limited due to racist stereotypes, and I want to say that they're controlling stereotypes that is foisted upon Asian women's bodies. For example, Asian women are compliant, right? Asian women are passive. They are sexually available. They serve the needs of a white masculinist culture. I just found out that in the mail order bride industry, 94% of the recipients, the people that are buying mail order brides, are white males, right? So it's really, you can see how these damaging stereotypes related to Asian women's bodies and sexuality become manifested within the work, within labor, within what's open to them. And they're, I guess and this is for lack of a better word, because I'm still processing these things. I see these as like they're intimacy jobs, right? Economies of intimacy, right? That includes massage, nail salons, nannies, right? And there's and it's subtle how those stereotypes, the controlling stereotypes, fuel the access to what kind of jobs are available, right, for Asian women. And so I bring this up because this gets back to misogyny again, but because when denials that the Atlanta shootings had nothing to do with race, it seemed to support, for one thing, a misogynistic response that it wasn't racism, which in my mind, I interpreted it as you're excusing the perpetrator, you're giving, you're basically, that kind of comment attempted to excuse the act because it wasn't racism, right? B, it had nothing to do with patriarchy because he was a lone actor who had, a sex addiction. And that both of these responses together aimed at denying a type of misogyny that is aimed towards Asian women. And that's what I was trying to really think about, right? What kind of misogyny is aimed towards Asian women? So Black feminists have described a type of misogyny aimed towards Black women as a form of misogynoir, right? And so Daniel Hortzclaw, for instance, was a police officer who targeted Asian American or African American women. So I kept thinking, well, what's going on here, right? And I can't help but think that the global conditions, the historical context, right, how the settler capitalist economies paved the way for what I think I'm calling a misogynistic Orientalism, right? And that resulted in an incel-like attack on Asian women, right? Misogyny is not just a hatred of women, it's elevated to a point of hostility, right? That these Asian women threatened, right, the guy, right? And I felt like there was something going on here. So a broader historical structural analysis is needed to explain the misogyny that escalates to hostility and violence. And so these historical legacies serve to support the pillars of colonial logics that perpetuate the sexualization of Asian women's bodies and the ensuing gaslighting that occurs among some of our leaders in Congress, for instance, prevent an understanding, I think, of what we mean by a hate crime. Because I agree with you, Dr. Kajihiro, that a naive understanding of hate is a psychological individual framework. but a hate crime understood based on social historical structures that have consistently oppressed groups of women, that's a different type of hate crime, right? In the same way that misogyny is not just a hatred of women, but it's a hatred of women that elevates to the hostilities, right? Based on social institutional structures. So I'll just end there. Sorry. I have so much more to process, but there's a lot to unpack, I think, from what I said.
No, thank you so much for sharing. I think that Dr. Bardwell Jones and Dr. Kajihiro really framed this in as quick as possible, because there's so much history behind this, but really gave the key points in understanding, from the Hawaii context, the Pacific context, why we should care if we are not Chinese, if we are not Korean, if we are Japanese American, this umbrella term of Asian, how we are all affected equally by misogyny, by sexualization, by racism. And so I'm going to get reactions right now from others on the panel. I'm going to tap into Naomi and Tom in just a bit, but I really want to focus on Teresa, because she's a proud mommy. And she's raising, an Asian daughter. So can you give us some of your reactions to what you just heard?
Yes, thank you. I'm also raising a white man, and I'm married to one too. But I just wanted to thank Dr. Bardwell Jones for, just everything that he had said before. And I think it's really interesting, because I listen to the language that we are using all together. And what I'm doing is I'm translating it into how I talk to the other generations about it. And it's fascinating, because, we talk about misogyny in my women in literature class. We talk about all of these ideas. And it's fascinating to me to watch them, and painful to watch my young women realize their connection to these terms, because it's, when I think about misogyny, when I think about the exoticization of Asian women, I'll bring up something. A couple of years ago, I had a paper that someone wrote for me, and she basically wrote it about the fact that a certain school on the island considered the girls from my school to be trophy girlfriends, because they were usually Asian and Christian, but smart enough to keep up with everybody, but submissive enough not to push things. And so if you had a girlfriend from this school, then that was cool. And I remember, getting this paper and sitting down with her, and her going, oh my God, this is everything we've been talking about in class. And I said, yep, it really, really is. And so, I mean, obviously the events in Atlanta were horrible, and I'm processing it as well. But I always go back to where it starts for me. I always go back to the language that people use for one another, to what our young people are learning, and how to kind of mitigate all of that, because all of the history, and I think about it again as an educator. It's what do we teach and what do we not teach, and how do we talk about these things, and for me, I think, when I'm in the classroom, it's one thing, and then when I'm with my children, it's quite another. You'll hear about it in the poem later on, but when I was living in Washington and I was walking around with my son, I'd always get asked what my rates were, because we need good nannies, but if my husband, who is white, was walking around with our Asian daughter, they'd be like, oh, what a beautiful adopted daughter that is. There'd be assumptions there. And, it's just fascinating to me to listen to all of it, because for me, it's about how to how to bring all of it to, how to apply all of this, you know. Again, you know, my 9-year-old may not understand intersectionality, but I can still talk to her about it. And in a way, you know, I'm just grateful that all of us are having the conversation, because we all understand this on so many different levels. Dr. Bardwell-Jones, I'd love to talk with you further about how to, you know, bring a lot of what you have to my students, you know, in a way that will be meaningful for them. And again, you know, I'm just grateful. I'm just grateful for all of it. But it's hard, and you know, I'm still processing it as well, as I think the rest of us are. And the other thing that I'll say is that it makes me so sad. Something will happen and I'll have to go back to class. Everybody, I have to go back to class every other day and say, here's another thing that just happened. How are we going to process this? How am I going to hold you? How are you going to hold each other? Because this is what has been foisted on them. And that is, as I said, that's the way I work with it every day. But
thank you for sharing that, you know, so candidly, that right now, you know, we have a dilemma among educators and educators of our youth about how we bring this history to frame our realities. I wanted to just kind of read real quickly into the comments right now on our YouTube stream and write comments. How about U.S. military personnel action against women in Asian countries of Vietnam, Korea, Japan, Okinawa, Guam, and Hawaii? And so I wanted to beam in on Naomi because she has done a lot of advocacy, you know, around educating our communities about militarism in Okinawa, how that's affected Okinawan women. But also, you know, Naomi is from the southern United States and has lived in this environment on the continental U.S. Where, you know, she's shared with me that she's felt unsafe just being an Asian woman. So can you Naomi, can you share with us, you know, how all of this is coming together from you hearing this history and understanding the history of Okinawa and your realities today as an Asian woman?
Yeah, so I first just want to echo deep gratitude for having others, who, you know, between, you know, Kyle Kajihiro and, you know, Dr. Barbara Jones to give us that foundation of historical foundations and understandings. One, so I don't have to in this, because so much to unpack. Yeah, so much, so many layers, intersections, collisions, even sometimes how I feel about these intersections. Yeah, so gratitude for that, because what I'll speak to in this moment is from my own internal map, what is in my body, what my, you know, familial experience is. And so, you know, even my reluctance to enter a space to open my mouth, like I'm to hold space for others. But I reflected and realized, you know, I think it is important. First of all, I would even acknowledge I am born of US military, Japanese occupation of my mother, you know, my maternal ancestral islands. That is where I was born, and I was born into that. And so, yes, that experience of knowing not only for myself, I was too young then, but knowing that my own family and seeing it, and then in the media also seeing it, so many layers of how Okinawan women, Shimanchu, we are hypersexualized, and the violence, like that was front and center in so much of all of it. So I don't know a point at which I didn't have that awareness that that was the world I was born into. Yeah. But we also moved to the US when I was very, very little, before I even started school. And so there's even a blur between where that life and that reality becomes what I also was born into, in who I am. So my earliest memories are also of, and constantly have since been, of being in spaces and especially in the Southern US, where folks, depending on who I'm next to, how I'm seen, will say and act and reveal different things that showed me, even as a child early on, how people really thought about so many different ways of seeing and perceiving myself and my family, my community, yeah? And so I too became very quickly aware that even in the US, our bodies, my family, even myself, hypersexualized. And not only that, but I also personally experienced, and I know so many in my family and friends, my communities have seen that unfortunately those who are most endangered, most vulnerable, it is not increased law enforcement or military presence, the increased militarization that actually protects those who are most vulnerable, endangered. And if anything, even as a kid, without having a way to speak to it, I saw very clearly those things actually, the safety for one actually is what endangered. And so I wanted to be able, actually, I'm grateful for that comment to broach that, because I wanted to be able to even hear in this space, because it's so rare. I think it's a challenging thing to carve out spaces, even amongst my more closer friends, family, to acknowledge in these moments that our reactions to think about how to become safer, the reactions with all the pathos, the emotions, the fear that comes out of these moments, I actually have on top of that even more anxiety when I think about one of those responses being an immediate jump for example, the kind of officer who will immediately erase and dismiss the mechanisms behind what put those women in a position of greater vulnerability within the context with which they live. So I acknowledge how many of those pieces, my family's experience of, increased military presence on our islands, and the dynamics of, I'm not Japanese in some communities' ways of thinking, and yet I was born Japanese, right? And I was also born American. And yet that intersection, again, sometimes what feels like collisions of identities, I know is not singular, right? I'm speaking from my experience, but I think of a lot of my friends in Guahan, thinking from actually a lot of our, in many ways, immediately, yes, our island, communities. And I don't want to focus only on these kinds of things, that the fears, the dangers that connect us, right? There's so much more richness and strength in our connections. But in this moment, I think it is very important to, again, have someone who's willing to comment, to speak to that we have to also think about what it means to create safer spaces as we're dismantling a lot of these mechanisms, because it's so easy to think, maybe, and we've been conditioned and socialized to think, I think particularly in US context, in Southern US, my experience was to hear people thinking police presence, or we need more of, and I just, that's part of where my brain has been really kind of shutting down, and how to even hold these conversations more publicly right now, because my so deep anxiety to see that jump to that, and knowing it is quite the opposite in the lived experience of so many of these women. And I can see within, like I said, my own immediate families and experience transnationally. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing. I want to jump right now to Tom. We went, from history, to the present day. Tom, can you share a little bit about your realities as, an Asian presenting man living in the South who has moved to Hawaii? How has the history played out in your reality? I'd really like to know.
Well, I wrote it down, but let's get the basics. Well, my family is half refugee and half immigrant. My father was a war refugee, while my mother on her side, was an immigrant because our auntie was married to an American white serviceman during the Vietnam War. And the people that were able to easily get out of Vietnam when the fall of the South Vietnam, was you either had to be very rich, very well connected to the Vietnamese elite, or to the Americans. And my folks were able to get their immigration pass for a few years due to my auntie and white uncle. And as a Southeast Asian man of Vietnamese descent, born and raised in Georgia, I really hate that state. In the metro Atlanta area, the larger concentrated general Asian communities are in the northeast metro area, places like Beaufort, Johns Creek, Duluth, and etc. Georgia, for the most part, is a predominantly white state with some predominantly black areas, such as the South metro area. I was raised in the South Side, and the folks invest in the North Side. The South Metro side is built that to make a living and enjoy life, you must travel 1 to 3 counties over, meaning little to no local opportunities, while the North Side is where most of the money is. The commute is hell with the out-of-date roads and congestion. So that's basically county over here is like what, an island? And be it redlining or by choice, plenty of segregated areas for people of color that you can tell the quality of it by the infrastructure along with the majority population. The Asian/Vietnamese immigrant community is very cliquey and assimilation by unusual model minority and being close to white people, be it business ties or having them as family members. A backward, highly individualistic state that enables the colorblind mentality and love them tokens. The very visible Asian groups tend to be Vietnamese, Korean, Chinese, and Indian. Despite being a large Bible Belt, other religions flourish in seclusion. Back home in Clayton County, despite having a 5% Asian population in the city of Maile, we had like 2 Asian cops. Clayton County is predominantly black, but have a majority white police force that seem to not live in the community. There is a saying in Clayton County, come to Clayton County for vacation, stay for probation. In Georgia, we have mass voter suppression movements, gun violence, human trafficking, excessive law enforcement. We have closet Republicans running as Democrats. It is a purple-red leaning state. And I want to get this out, to squeeze it in. Basically, the importance of the Jesse Murray case in regards. If you were to Google that case, the short thing is, black man denies the right to stand his ground, even though a drunk former white cop and his buddies gang up on him, and the black guy's gun accidentally went off and killed him. And you want to ask, like, it's the comparison to Georgia, right? Hawaii to Georgia. Basically, you have a predominantly Asian and Pacific Islander state versus a predominantly white and black state. You had a laid-back and more giving culture versus a draconian high-strung one. The Hawaiian plantations and racial caste are based on the mainland South, but the unique situation has prevented from being an exact copy. I see more broke and homeless Asians here in Hawaii, while I learned back home and from a guy that visited California where there's a large Asian population that the poor and homeless in our community are hidden to maintain the model minority myth. Hawaii has gentrification by wealthy foreigners, be it the mainland or Asia, causing a cost of living to go up and dumping white homeless from the mainland. While back home, it was wealthier folks trying to buy homes from the old local residents and economic stagnation causing people to move. And as I mentioned earlier, Georgia is white power haven due to its deep roots in white supremacy, courtesy of being land of the slaves and the Confederacy, along with being the battleground in the civil rights movement. And it was Trump country and still has a large immigration detention center, Stewart Detention Center. And there are folks who like to think that this isn't Georgia because the stark contradiction in Georgia is having a large immigrant community due to the attractive colleges, the economic boom of the 90s, and the new international status due to the Olympics, and 30 years as a refugee center. And the thing you have to understand with Georgia is the state loves cheap labor and making folks miserable. From its early days as a penal colony under English rule, to racial chattel slavery, to cheap immigrant labor, to the prison industrial complex. So yeah, I got through like, what, 3 out of 4 points on my notes here. Anything else?
We appreciate that, Tom. And I think, and it's so complex. Asian is such an umbrella term. Asian American is such an umbrella term. You know, as an Aboriginal Ainu woman, I'm going to tell you Japanese is an umbrella term. Chinese is an umbrella term. It's so important to understand that we all have these individual identities along with our ethnicities, but socially, you know, we are impacted as people under this umbrella term, Asian and Asian American, and our experiences may be different. I want to acknowledge that due to location, due to history. I want to just mention really quickly in the comments that Chakazine thanks Willow for acknowledging that sex work is work. We're going a bit over time in discussion. So Willow, if you don't mind, because we're closing with you, I'm gonna jump into, we talked a little bit about the Georgia perspective, jump back over to the Hawaii perspective, because that's not really something that's being acknowledged in the conversations nationwide. And yet, you know, as Tom brought up, predominantly in population, we are in a state or occupied state that is in political control with people of Asian ethnicity. So I want to bring it back to Dr. Kyle Kajihiro. Within the last, 24 hours, Asian woke Twitter has gone off around this term of Asian settlerism and Asian settler colonialism. And we're seeing this term right now, and these headlines. The Asian community, you know, is pouring out tears, you know, in heartbreak. We are seeing a lot of Kanaka Maoli stand up in protection of Asians. We are also seeing, you know, Kanaka Maoli express that perhaps, you know, Asians in Hawaii are having a hard time seeing and framing oppression because our reality in the current time, in the current context, is privilege. You know, and this again may not be across the board, right? And I have to acknowledge that myself, as a woman who is Japanese American passing in the state of Hawaii, might have a very different experience than, say, Dr. Bardwell Jones or Teresa with their backgrounds, or even that of Naomi, who is, you know, Okinawan background, right? It's very, very complex in this state. And yet, right now on social media, we see the young folks talking about Asian settlerism and Asian settler colonialism, which is a good thing. I'm glad that they're talking. It's just a very sensitive time, and I'm even seeing very emotional reactions about this from our scholars. Have you been able, Dr. Kajihiro, to kind of view what's been going on right now, the buzz on social media, and do you have anything that you can offer in terms of perspective around Asian settlerism, Asian settler colonialism, and the Hawaii context?
I haven't actually been following all that on social media, but I have some thoughts on it. I mean, I think that we can be, it's not an either or situation, right? We can be targets of particular forms of power as well as perpetrators at the same time, or even conduits, right? I think of power as kind of multivalent. It's moving in different directions, and different forms of power based on race, sex, sexual orientation, national identity, religion. They're kind of cross-cutting, and they flow through us in different ways. So you can be, on the one hand, a target of sort of misogyny or racism. At the same time, you're perpetuating it, or it's flowing through you and your behaviors and your positionality to affect others. And so I don't see it as an exclusive thing, but it's always about having to be critical and looking at where you are positioned in whatever context that is, and that might change from whatever situation you're in and who you're relating to, because power is a relational effect, right? It's not just a static thing. It's always in relation to someone else, somewhere else. And so I think, you know, we can be Asian settlers in Hawaii with certain kinds of privilege, and also be harmed by anti-Asian violence that's happening in these other places, and having to also be responsible for what privilege we might have and our position in a place like Hawaii, to be sure to stand with Kanaka Oiwi in their struggles, to stand with other people in Black Lives Matter or Indigenous struggles, to use whatever privilege we have in our social positioning to advance justice for all. And I just want to share a little bit of sort of my personal experience. So I'm old enough to remember when Vincent Chin was murdered because of the trade wars that were going on with Japan, but he was just Asian, right? Chinese American, but racialized as someone who was killing the auto industry and was killed in Detroit. And when one of the moments in my own politicization was when I was living in Portland, Oregon, an Ethiopian man was killed by neo-Nazi skinheads. And it was sort of a wake up for me that could have been me. It could have been any of my friends or colleagues. And I've been called, various anti-Asian epithets, referring to Southeast Asian, Chinese, or Japanese. And so the anti-Asian, they don't discriminate so much on our ethnicities. And so in some ways that means we're sort of forced into the same boat in terms of the kinds of struggles that we have, and we got to hold on to each other, even if the particularities of our situation are different, and that we don't want to smooth those over or paper them over. But at the same time, we are targeted by this kind of violence in certain ways, which means we have to, we can't just sit back and say it doesn't affect us. So I guess that's just my pitch to others as we're thinking about what is our kuleana in this particular situation, is that we need to step up and be counted and be in solidarity.
Thank you for acknowledging that. Dr. Bardwell-Jones, do you have any comments on this issue? First off, have you kind of seen some of the banter back and forth on social media?
Yes, just a little bit. And I guess I'm the first thing that comes to my mind is just about cultivating, transnational solidarities and really trying to understand what solidarity means, even in this climate of identity politics that tend to get misinterpreted in ways that could undermine these efforts of solidarity. I do agree with Dr. Kajihiro about how power flows and how one can be a colonizer and also suffer from colonization, right? And that dual sense has to be kept in view at all times. And I think it's being able to listen, to generate aspects of I want to say critical empathies, like that it's not just empathy, like I feel for you, but that we're in a particular critical stance of solidarity against, racism, colonialism, queer, homophobia, LGBT, like all of these issues, and the poor and the oppressed, right? Like all these groups that suffer the yoke of racism and colonialism and all of that. And so what I'm seeing now is that a lot of the scholars, it's always about the power to name, the power to define, right? How do we know who the perpetrator is? How do we understand and diagnose the crime itself, right? What is going on there? And there's various wonderful analytical frameworks that are being set up by many of these Asian settler scholars, who I find kind of taking the time to pave the path of understanding the relationships of responsibilities that we have with each other. And so, yeah, there's more to say here because it's slowly unfolding. But when I first came across Asian settler colonialism, I felt, initially offended by the fact that Asians could be perpetrators of colonial violence when my family have suffered the yoke of that sort of violence and colonial violence. But then, they've changed, they've really, that whole perspective has changed me in thinking about social justice policies and activism that needs to be grounded within, critical capacities of care and sympathy about our own complicities of perpetrating, violence. And so there's more to say, but I'll just end there.
Thank you so much. Teresa, local girl, educator in these islands. So when you're hearing about these very critical conversations going on right now about, how Asians in Hawaii are internalizing these headlines, Asian settlers, Asian settlerism, what are your reactions?
Well, my husband and I were talking about this morning, what makes local, right? I moved here when I was 9 and I was raised in California. And then I went to high school here and have been here ever since. For me, it's about the empathy. It's about the idea of understanding who you are in context to other people. And because I am an educator, I will once again center my students in that experience. And for me, it brings to mind the fact that my seniors, there's this critical time after my seniors graduate, and it's the Christmas after they graduate, and then they come back and they see me. And I can't wait because their eyes are big and they're like, Mrs. Falk. And I went, you're Asian American now, aren't you? I mean, it's a joke, but it's not. Like, they come back and they're like, wait, all of these things are happening on the continent. I'm like, yes, they are. But they come back also, and it's hard because they come back with a relief to be home, right? It's all over their Instagrams. It's like, I'm in a place where I can be safe again. And I'm in a place where, I can be separate. And then we talk a little bit more and they realize no, because they have witnessed other things, that they have a bigger responsibility to that. And so it's always fascinating for me, the idea, like, we never talk about the idea, again, it's terms, right? Settler colonialism, but they sure do understand that when they come back, there's someone different and they see themselves in context to other people in a very different way. And as a result of that, I mean, it's hard because some of them are just like, whew, we're back home. It's great. And then some of them are like, wait, I have a bigger responsibility. And then they start going in newer directions. And so, even down to the point of, one of my students the other day saying, we need to pray for all of the Asian Americans on the continent. Actually, she said mainland, but I don't use mainland. So, she said, we need to pray for all of those people. And I went, aren't you Asian American too? Or I asked, I said, is that the way you identify? Do we in Hawaii need those prayers as well? And she just went, oh, I guess we do. Yes, I guess we do. But it was initially absolutely a reaction of, that's not us. We are not them. And then, it's only after a little bit of prodding that they understand that. So, I guess my overall reaction is that, it's certainly us. Now, it's a different kind of responsibility and a different kind of identity. But again, it's the power of the naming, because the power to name themselves, the power to understand why those names happen, and the power to understand what power comes with that and the responsibility that comes with it. So, yeah, so for me, it's about helping my students understand who they are in relation to others, not telling them who they are, but having them dig it out for themselves, certainly.
So Naomi, your lens on this is very interesting. You're that younger generation. I'm not sure if you've been active on social media in the last 24 hours. You're very busy. Have you seen some of the things that have been going on? And not only are you of that younger generation, but you're actually a newer resident to the Hawaiian Islands. So, what is your take on a lot of this buzz that's going on around this dialogue around Asian settlerism and the response of Asians to these headlines who live in the Hawaii context?
Yeah, so first I will admit, both because of other goings on this weekend, like last 24 hours, I've not at all seen really what most recent social media is. But I will also say, like prior to that, most immediately, in the first 24 hours after news was kind of spreading about these acts of violence, I couldn't look at mainstream media. Social media was actually where I went. It was one of the many quick ways for a lot of us, I think, to reach out and to check in with each other. Again, because of all of the different, so much to unpack all at once, right? Not just this week, but of course, centering those particular victims and that community, especially given the concentric circles of connections and realization. So like, yes, like social media, there was so much, but I will also say within that, I'm not in conversation like with very many other, like for example, Shimanchu or different pockets like on Twitter or whatever. Like I sign on and Kanaka Twitter, for example, was like, and I was grateful to see many of these different conversations. But what I'm not really seeing, and it might just be because of how I have learned to just unabashedly just be maybe part of it is I'm not welcomed into some of the conversations in the community, but I don't see these conversations have been even on social media, not just in the real world. They've often been compartmentalized. Yeah. And so it's one of the many reasons I am like blown away, very grateful for co-creating spaces like this, because I alluded to it to the beginning. I've part of what's been challenging for me to process is not just the emotional landscape of this week's events. It's been even trying to fathom how to have the sort of spaces and connections of these communities. So in some ways you think, oh, social media opens up to everything, but actually even on social media, I'm seeing still a lot of compartmentalized conversations. And it has been hard to see some communities not quite acknowledging it, or maybe just, and it's not in judgment I say, but maybe just some of the layers of it, some of the pieces. And, I know this is not social media bite-sized thing to just post here, but like these kinds of conversations that go into the history, the nuance. I wish there was an easier way to bring that into, or bring, to have that space, because the first few days like that I could keep up with, it was kind of challenging to see like the blessings mixed curse of social media to process this kind of layered events, implications of. So I don't know if that really speaks to that.
Yeah, no, it's a very complex topic, but thank you for bringing that thing about, nuances, right? Shakazine makes a comment. He says, thank you for not attempting to tackle sex worker issues without a sex worker on the panel. I just want to let Shakazine know, towards the end of this, when we wrap up, I would really like to give Shakazine a platform, knowing that Shakazine actually has ear to the ground on what's been going on. Has shared with me a lot of really great resources about how we support sex workers, which I put in the stream of the event. And so Shakazine, I want to invite you to kind of share what you know from how we can better support sex workers during this time. But yes, making sure that people of the community speak for themselves is something that's very important to me. I've seen a lot of streams about, API, AAPI, Asians in America. None of it really spoke to me. And so I really had to invite, I really wanted to make sure that we were doing a panel. We were inviting what is reflective of the Asian community in Hawaii. And, we're not a monolith, and we're no longer, just one race. And like I said, people that have this label of Chinese, it's a huge umbrella term. People have this label of Japanese. Believe it or not, that's a huge umbrella term. There are many different distinct ethnicities, even in the archipelago of Japan. For myself, as a Kanaka, over the years, I have really stepped back from putting forward my Kanaka Maoli identity, especially marrying a very, brown-skinned, handsome Kanaka Maoli, when I walk into a store with him and I see a Nikkei woman clutch her purse and walk away from him, like that really hurts me. I understand that I didn't have that experience with my community until walking into that community with a Kanaka Maoli man, a very big man with a very big presence by my side. I have seen reactions from family members rejecting my children who are Kanaka Maoli as well as Filipino. And so I think that if comments from the Kanaka Maoli community have surfaced, what I'm hearing is from the Kanaka Maoli viewpoint is, please hear us. We have a history of being erased on our own land. We have a history of being oppressed. And then when Japanese Americans took political power, we have, like right now, currently the governor Ige, somebody who is of Japanese and Okinawan descent, right? A direct threat to Kanaka Maoli sacred spaces. And I think what I hear the Kanaka Maoli community is saying is, hear us, understand us, use this frame of reference that's going on with this pain in the Asian community and understand how we're under attack, right? And so thank you all for, engaging these very difficult conversations. We don't all have the same perspective. We have different histories, but we need to find these intersectionalities. So Willow, hearing this, right? What are the intersections for you? This discussion about, Asian settlers, Asian settlerism in Hawaii. Obviously, you as a resident here have seen what's going on in the headlines and have been just devastated. We can hear it in your poetry. What surfaces for you? We're going to answer that, and then we're going to wrap up. That we've been going on for almost 2 hours now. We're at an hour and 46. So we're going to talk about our next steps after Willow kind of addresses this question.
Thank you. Many years ago, I took a class at KCC, and it was about race relations. It was really ideal because it was right during the Rodney King aftermath, and there were many things discussing identity that were at the forefront. And a project that we had at that point in time was to interview someone, preferably a grandparent, about how things had changed. Because my dad got a start late in the game, he would have been the age of a grandparent, and I didn't have any grandparents to interview. So I interviewed him, which was already a challenge because he was kind of a man of few words. But I really cherished that opportunity to have a project to frame the importance of something, because in Asian culture, if it's a scholastic pursuit, then it's like, okay, it has the seal of approval. So he helped me out, and he was the subject of the interview. I think what was really surprising at that point in time is that my dad really, he didn't embrace the idea or the identity of Asian. Of course, he thought of himself as Chinese, but of the generation he was, he referred to himself in the interview as Oriental, because when he went to the continent, which we at that time called the mainland as well, they called him Oriental. So I got to see this little tiny window of that mindset of how Asian people weren't even Asian, they were Oriental, which of course smacks of imperialism. Now we have the term Asian. I remember even, I feel very bad because I tried to mansplain my own dad. I said, Dad, I think they call it Asian. Like, I wanted to try to bring him into the 90s and not use maybe this antiquity, this language of antiquity, right? But the thing is that within Asian people fight amongst themselves of who defines as Asian. And as a mixed race person, I've been exposed to that my whole life. It's like you're never enough of something. So in Hawaii, where we've had different groups and the perceived pecking order, people might think of Asian as, Chinese and Japanese and Korean and Vietnamese, and then it just kind of drops off. They don't think of Laotians, they don't think of Nepalese people, they don't think of Filipinos or Indians and everyone else in the Indonesian people. They just don't have that functioning awareness, and I don't fault them. It's just you go by what is right in front of you, right? But they don't realize that that umbrella is so inclusive. So I think that's part of the problem paired with the fact that people do have this false perception that we're on the top of the totem pole, so it doesn't impact us. So I want to just quickly share this little thing because I think it's meaningful. Back in the day, there was a film called The English Patient, which was a very popular film, and it swept the Oscars, and it was based on a book of the same name written by Michael Ondaatje, who spoke at UH. He's also biracial, right? He's Sri Lankan and Caucasian. Forgive me for not knowing the particulars. But I love The English Patient. I watched this film many times, and because of when it was released, it reminded me of my experiences in the Middle East. And of course, I'm a sucker for a love story, a tragic one, and I love things from the 1940s. I later bought both the screenplay and I read the book because I know that when things are adapted for screen, something gets lost in translation. I could have never expected that the role of Kip, who was the sapper, he was the Sikh gentleman who, there were two parallel love stories, right? And so his role was completely diminished and made much smaller. And in the book, his role shows how a person of color navigates these different worlds and the responsibility. He diffuses bombs, which is very meaningful. And in the story, he gives a lot of impassioned and rightful pushback to the reality that Asian people, that the Japanese were on the receiving end of the bomb. And this is something that really, really upsets me because everything from the 20th century on is defined by World War II, all of those various narratives. And our world is so linked to the outcome or the perceived outcome of World War II. And the fact that our nation chose to bomb another nation, another sovereign nation, and I understand in war, people think all is fair, but I think you have to have limits, you have to have boundaries. We went and we intentionally annihilated another country, and the people on the receiving end are Asian. And so when we wonder, other than these industries, why are Asian people subject to violence? We have a nation that has systemically encouraged this time and time again through warfare, through policies, through denial. I mean, when you go and you wipe out people through a nuclear means, you're basically trying to ensure that the next generation won't happen. And I think that a lot of soul searching must also include this reality, because when we saber rattle and we try to tell other sovereign nations what they can do, and we try to look like the good guy with a nuclear agreement, like in the case with Iran, it's like, who used the bomb? That's, I think, should be the first question. And who's on the receiving end? Sorry, there's more I could say, but I'm gonna not be vala'au.
Mahalo nui. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective. I would like the panel to just kind of think at this time. Our last question is, where do we go from here? And as the panel is thinking about that, I am going to invite Teresa to switch over from her teacher and intellectual hat into her poetess intellectual hat, and share with her how she's, processing this from her na'au and her emotions through poetry.
Thank you very, very much. I feel like I should introduce this with a little bit more of a background of myself. So my mother was Filipina. My father was a white Navy commander. He was actually the executive officer at Subic Bay in the late 1950s and married my mother on base. And together they were there for a while. And then I came around in 1969. And it's fascinating because the poem that I'd like to share with you today is called A Question for Brent Baker's Father. And for me, the poem really is about the roots of our misogyny and the roots of you know, this violence on Asian women's bodies. When I wrote it, I thought, you know, that maybe there weren't very many things that have happened to me. You know, I thought myself lucky in a way. And then I wrote the poem and I went, oh, wow, no, that's not the case at all. And lots of things came to the surface. So thank you very much for listening to this. This is called a question for Brent Baker's father. In 1974, you passed me as I sat on a chair beside your son in front of the principal's office. I was 5 years old. You stopped to look at my stained dress, bloodied from the bite that he had given me on the playground. He bit me because I would not let him drive the rowboat that was anchored in the sand. You lunged, and for a moment I thought that you would attack me, and indeed, you kept your eyes on mine as you dragged your son out of his seat by his red striped shirt and slapped his face because this little chink girl had not cried but pushed him down. I watched the light in Brent's blue eyes go out, and suddenly the two of you looked exactly the same. Was it father or son at the Alabama gas station in 1960 when my Filipina mother asked which bathroom she should use, the white or the colored? Which one of you looked her up and down leering and told her she was pretty, so in this state she could be white? Which one of you was the manager at the ice cream parlor I worked at when I was 18? Which one insisted that I wear that too tight tank top because it would look so nice against my golden skin and show off my sweet double scoops? Which one of you pressed me against the side of your car at Sandy's one windy night when I was 20, telling me between kisses how much you liked Hapa girls because they had Asian personalities, but white girl tits? Was it you or you at the Ypsilanti Ford sales lot in 1992, selling chances to hit a Toyota with a sledgehammer for $1? Which one of you stopped and smiled at me with yellow teeth as I paused to gape in shock and shame and then offered me a swing for free? Was it you or you at the Bainbridge Island playground 4 years ago who saw me with my blonde and blue-eyed son and asked me how much I charged for my services because it was so hard to get good nannies these days? Was it you or you at the Ala Moana coffee shop that touched my 6-year-old daughter's dark hair and called it beautiful mahogany? Was it you or you that said you were way too old for her, but that she'd make some man very happy someday? Which one? You or you? I can't tell the difference. You all look the same.
Thank you so much. Sometimes I really feel that we need poetry and music. We can intellectualize these things, but sometimes
Yes.
we just need to feel. And so thank you. That was very validating and healing for me to hear those words. Mahalo nui. So it's time to get back to work for the panel. This is probably the most difficult question, but the most important of the time that we've shared and spent together. And I would like to start back with Tom and Naomi. Where do we go from here? What might be some solutions to protecting Asian women and girls and to protecting people that fall under this umbrella term of Asian Americans? What would be some solutions around protecting Asian bodies from violence? So give us some perspective from, the Southern continental US point of view on what has worked and what has definitely not worked. Tom, can we start with you?
One sec. Yeah, I'm flipping through my notes and it's a lot to process. It's very intersectional. All right. I guess you asked me a question about, I want to say a couple of days ago, how to normalize not sexual assaulting women. And that question is like, who are you asking? It's like, are we asking non-Asian men or Asian men? It's like with like non-Asian men, like white men, they're stubborn, privileged fools, and that's white people's responsibility. And non-Asian men are not only indoctrinated, but also have their own issues with their opposite sex counterpart due to colonialism. So men and women of color have to work with one another to deprogram ourselves and not use each other as tools. Then there for the Asian people, right? Asian men and women. Then yet underneath that part is like those born overseas versus those born and raised in the West. Overseas in Asia, there's a Asian patriarchy. The men take the women for granted and treat them as pawns that led to experiencing generational karma in the form of such as white male, Asian female relationship having racial caste dynamic implications. Asian American history has been about cheap labor, population control, prevention of formation of families and communities, and having influence in Asia that often lead to the war and the dehumanization of Asians, especially the women. It's like from the women overseas, you no longer an Asian patriarchy, but a white one. Whatever feelings or grudges you have is like enabling white people, especially white men, condemn not only future generation of Asian men, but also Asian women. Asian women need to look at the media propaganda that non-Asian men consume and how willing our folks are able to enable it for the perceived perk leading to the harms of our communities. Basically, sex-positive feminism versus anti-objectification case. The white male, Asian female relationship are the basic thing that Joe and Jane Asian average sees. And basically that implied that Asian women's body belong to white men and exist to prop their egos by excusing their actions in our communities. White men are willing to kill Asian men for Asian women and end up killing Asian women if denied or discomforted by them. While Asian men born and raised in the West are basically born into no man's land and more likely feel the oppressive white patriarchy along with low to no support from our communities due to various complicated identities, be it cultural birthplace, LGBT status, and for the opposite sex counterpart. We are blamed for white men's action by Asian women, a la Elliot Rodgers shooting case. Regardless, we need to stand by Asian women, be patient, and there are those who will support us in turn. By doing so, we preserve a whole culture instead of one side trying to cut off their other half from oppressors. So I guess what I'm trying to get on is basically we need to cut the propaganda machine that have implications on our daily lives, which basically our relationship, be it from one race to another to the men and women in that particular racial group. Because as a mainlander, I see too much of this propaganda. And there's another one that's relating to East Asian privilege, but I'll let Naomi speak her part before getting on to that.
Thank you so much, Tom. So, Naomi, what are your thoughts? Where do we go from here?
Such an unfair but very necessary question to answer in with time constraints. Yeah, so just a couple thoughts about that is, so grateful to have the conversations, dialogues like this that do look at the historical, the structural analysis, how so much of these interlocking mechanisms are what we're facing. And forgiving my nerves earlier, I was talking about the social media and the compartmentalization of communities and conversations, broad brushstrokes. But what I feel in terms of moving forward is that it's one thing to have spaces where we talk about and acknowledge that history and the underlying that mechanizations, the structural, the needs to acknowledge that. But I guess I yearn for, and part of it is maybe even intergenerational dynamics. I yearn for spaces where it's important. Like, I think first, yes, is that foundation, that history and understanding of the greater interconnections of what we face. And I say we, knowing individually, concentric circles, what that definition we all have shared can mean different things. But again, with that, I don't want to just have that understanding, but to also have these kinds of spaces where collectively in different circles and more broadly spaces where we're linking up to brainstorm how to dismantle that, not just acknowledge that it needs to be dismantled. And, you know, I appreciate, because it is part of the privilege I have, the experience of moving transnationally and living and being raised in the American South, come what may with all the other pieces of it. I did not grow up with a large community of other Shimanshu or even many other Asian or Asian Americans, right? And so actually a lot of my experience has been in learning what the buzzword of solidarity is often thrown around, but for me it was about finding a safer space and knowing it's not right to just enter and start to speak, but to watch and learn first. And so given where I grew up, I was informed. I learned from many of the Black and Brown and Indigenous communities that were around me, whose histories and embedded struggles, that again, so much to even begin to dive into here, but the actions that they were taking and building spaces, not only to acknowledge these foundations, but to brainstorm in the day-to-day, in the moment-to-moment, not in a reactionary stance, but in a lived experience in each moment, how to think about how our life actually is about dismantling all those things. So I don't know what that means. And I mean, I have ideas, but again, in this, within the context of our finite time. But I guess if anything, one thing I would say is to think about this conversation, these dialogues as an invitation. I mean, I'm actually, like I said, I didn't feel like I should be part of this panel in so many ways, but I also want to acknowledge, and that's because of the wealth of information, experienced, and expertise that the rest of these panelists bring. And yet at the same time, some of I would say it's important to think about these connections, again, even intergenerationally in our communities, transnationally in our communities. And so I just want to share, like, I didn't want to speak because I don't like being in front of a camera, but I do know that a theme for me throughout all of this is leaning into the things that are uncomfortable, that are messy and complicated. And so I'm sharing this as a reminder for myself, but really because I know what it's like to sit and watch and think like, oh, they speak so eloquently, they're so learned and have that foundational knowledge and understandings, the vocabulary for it. And I do know, because I have been part of conversations with peers who, yeah, they didn't understand me when I first moved to Hawaii and spoke about Asian like, those dynamics, but are now finding even those words and what that means. So I think it is important for us to think individually about how in our day-to-day, again, not just as a reaction to these things, but how we lean into our own understandings of the complicated ways, but also the beautiful ways, the healing ways in which, and then to think about how our communities do also, because as we said, like it or not, we are often, put together in different configurations of identity. We do need to acknowledge that power is relational. So we need to think about the relationships that we want and find ways, again, not just from a reactionary defensive standpoint, but from a stance of, thank you for reminding us earlier that Dr. Varbo Jones, you said it, it was, our positionality is what gives us empathy, right? That can actually be that strength rather than to fall back, to hide in guilt, but to embrace it as a deepening of understanding. So it means a lot of things, but key thing I guess I'm saying is to think about leaning into that, the challenges with empathy for ourselves and how maybe, again, how we are born into some of these intersections that are painful or difficult to discuss. And then to use that empathy as we hold space for each other. And I don't mean just under the different segments of the sort of umbrella term of Asian or Asian American communities, but again, speaking from the perspective I was born into and where I was raised, beyond just the Asian American community. And specifically, I was calling to name, to mind when I spoke of what hyper militarization and policing of communities under the guise of protecting you know, to question in whatever we do, however we are working within our communities, before something happens, but in our day-to-day, what it means to carve out safer spaces for each other in all of the communities that we are connected and move through, whatever aina we are upon, and to think about that empathy, not fear or guilt in a reaction to, but that empathy to guide us in what tools, specifics we come up with collectively. And so again, way much bigger about what that means, but to think about it in terms of first self, immediate community, and how our communities can reclaim that power as a relational dynamic we build together for our healing. And again, beyond just an Asian American community. So sorry if that was a bit too long, but that's what's been weighing heavily in my fears of seeing, again, these different layered conversations and people being reaching out. And I wanted to speak to why I was reluctant. I thought maybe invitation was a mistake to ask me to speak, because I get too nervous and I lose my points. But I just really, really, really want to underscore that empathy is what will help us answer the specifics of what that looks like in each of our communities, and how our communities then collectively can rewrite our narratives together, and it not just be based upon what is imposed on us.
Thank you for that. Absolutely not a mistake to invite you. I'm sure the panel and the audience will agree with that. Thank you for those thoughtful words. Naomi, you might want to prepare your poem at this time. For the audience watching, we want to invite, if there's any audience out there, to share live. We're going to finish up the panelists answering this question about where we go from here. And, you know, you'll have the opportunity to actually share on camera, and we'll provide some of that information, but just setting you guys up for, you know, what the flow is going to be. Teresa, I know this is it's a difficult question to answer. As somebody so entrenched in the community, as an educator, and as a mother who wants a world that is safe for your children, where would you like to see us going from here?
You know, I'm very lucky because I have so many communities. I have so many of those beautiful concentric circles that we were talking about. And, you know, I was very kind of moved by Tom's comment about, you know, cutting the propaganda machine in our daily lives. I get to do that every single day in my classroom. And so my answer to this, at least for myself, because I don't have answers for everybody else, but I do for me. And for me, it is education. It is getting into that classroom. It is creating a safe space for my students to be able to talk to one another, to create empathy, to encourage them to create their own safe spaces and invite people into their circle. It is having them write poetry and having them be understanding of what it means to feel, no matter where you are on the gender spectrum, and being able to express yourself in a way that is honest. It's teaching them what dismantle means and having them understand the word and be able to use it. It's also understanding what happens after dismantling in terms of building, and all of it. So it is a really difficult question if I look at it in terms of where we all have to go. But what I love about all of this, and in a way, Naomi, I had the same kind of feeling when I was invited to the panel. I said, okay, you know, I know what these words mean. I do use them. I get it. But I'm in a little bit of a different sphere here. And I wondered about that. But in a lot of ways, I feel very confident, at least for myself, where I need to go. And that is my classroom. And I have taught for 30 years. And I have watched my students, my first students are turning 40, my very first students. This is how young I started. They are in government. They are teachers. They are business owners. They are doctors. They are attorneys. They are social justice warriors. They are everything that I could ever imagine. Oh, promised I wasn't going to cry. I'm breaking that promise. Because for me, that is how you deal with this. And that's how I do it concretely, is that you work within the community that you have. You work with the people you have around you every single day. And whether that means I talk to my juniors about what it means to dismantle a patriarchy, or I talk to my little boy about how it's totally fine that he wears nail polish and still wants to play video games, or how I talk to my beautiful brown daughter about how her dark skin is the most beautiful thing in the world, and to take up space because she deserves it. You know, that's what I will do every single day. So thank you all for letting me be here today and helping me to process and just being in the conversation. I value that so highly. So thank you, Mapuana, and everybody else.
Thank you for taking the time to be here, and thank you for contributing to this conversation. You know, again, initially, I was sitting the day that this tragedy happened. I'm sitting and I'm watching the headlines. I am bawling. I am just heartbroken for these victims and for these families. And I'm watching these live streams and it's like, okay, hit and miss. I'm glad to see Asian faces. I'm glad to see, you know, these perspectives out there, but it didn't quite speak to my reality of living in Hawaii, where we have all these multi layers of identity and perspectives. And so thank you all for being so willing to complicate the narrative, including JA Pilgrimages, who did not shy away from this conversation. I have to tell you, you know, though I have often been disappointed in the middle class to high class Japanese American identifying community in the Hawaii context, the descendants of camp survivors have never, ever, ever disappointed me, and they've never been afraid to stray away from human rights issues and complicated, conversations. So thank you so much, Japanese American Pilgrimages, for facilitating this platform. So I'm gonna rev it up just a little bit since we're coming to the end of the program, and try to get a little political with Dr. Kajihiro and Dr. Bardwell Jones. Tom had alluded to, never quite got to finish his point about East Asian privilege. And when we talk about these complicated layers and identities, the roots of a lot of this is East Asian, imperialism. Right? And how this might be internalized in our communities, in the diaspora. And in the reality is, like Naomi brought together, and, Teresa drove home the point of how this just very casually impacts our lives. We don't have to be scholars, but this is so intertwined in our life, is that we have people out there that want change, that want better, that want safer for Asian Americans. They want safer for Asian women and girls, but we are afraid of policies being put into place in the American colonial context that will end up harming Southeast Asians, that will end up harming brown bodies, that will end up harming Black bodies. It's very complicated. I don't expect us to have the answers, but if you could just kind of take us out with some of your thoughts about all of this. Where would you like to see us going from here?
Where are you throwing it to? Me or Professor Bardwell Jones?
Good question. Let's start with you. Got the mic. Let's start with you.
Yeah.
Okay. So I just want to just support everything that Teresa and Naomi and others have said. I think that, and this is not to exploit the tragedy, but I think that sometimes events like this happen that crack open our reality and makes it possible for us to, have to confront these histories, these contradictions, and form new ways of being in the world and new kinds of relationships. So I see it as teachable in that sense. And so, yes, absolutely, education, reaching back to those historical understandings, and connecting our own story to those histories in ways that not to not to be like, okay, well, we've had hardships, and so we've made it through, and so therefore, we're good, but to go back and remember those struggles and be responsible to that experience in terms of how we act in solidarity today, right? From wherever position we're at, that we need to do this in a collective way. And if it's about how do we make our community safer without resorting to more militarization, more policing, I read about some of the things that the community was doing in the East Bay, organizing patrols to keep their community safe. That's how the Black Panthers got started, was self-defense and ways of organizing ourselves. So maybe this is a moment too to revisit the politics in Asian American settings, instead of trying to aspire towards whiteness and towards assimilation and normalizing in that sense, that we celebrate our distinctness, our histories and diversity, and assert it in a way that's empowering, right? Through organizing and through sorts of actions that raise our voices, because that's going to also change the national and the international discourse around different groups. And then I just want to add one other thing about the foreign policy discourse, because again, Asian gets marked as alien, internally alien or foreign. And so whenever stuff is happening in Asia, with North Korea, with China, the Philippines, it rebounds back and affects people within the U.S. context. So we need to start shifting and challenging those international discussions, the demonizing of China, the demonizing of North Korea, end the Korean War, demilitarize our region so that we can have a different kind of relationship, right? So I just want to add those thoughts to our conversation, and we got to keep talking. I don't have all the answers. I'm learning so much from all of you, and I hope we can continue these conversations and strengthen the solidarities between everyone. Thank you.
Mahalo so much, Dr. Kajihiro. And I just want to, sometimes we all say things and we realize in reflection, hey, we can do a little bit better. I just want to ask, just to kind of drive home a point. Dr. Kajihiro, are you a descendant of internment camp survivors?
I'm not.
And so I wanted to just mention that because I speak from a place being a part of the Japanese community in Hawaii and kind of understanding the complex privilege that has in the Hawaii context. But I happen to know that Dr. Kajihiro is very reflective and is not a part of that history of internment. And so even I might say things that are attacking and might feel anti-Japanese or anti-Asian in a way. So I just want to clarify that our community is much more complicated than that. And we can kind of challenge ourselves to push ourselves out of these stereotypes. And so I'm going to bring it back home, or ask Dr. Bardwell Jones to kind of bring it back home with some final comments.
Thank you. I kept thinking of, I was just reading Dr. Kevin Nadal, who is a Filipino-American activist, psychologist, and he wrote about the term brown Asians, that there is a kind of privilege within Asian American communities that, place and he used these colors. It's a colorism that seems to be inherent in the Asian American community, where there is a hierarchy between lighter skinned Asians versus darker skinned Asians, and so even the term itself doesn't really aptly capture the term Asian aptly capture all of what the members of that group is supposed to fit into. And I think that there are moments again in which we are called to find the interstices of our connections, the interstices of our engagement with each other in ways that we can, again, with critical care and empathy, generate a better understanding of each other's plights. That being said, I also think that is what's important as well, in terms of moving forward, is to continue paths of resistance, resistance against a U.S., colonialism and the foreign force, the global politics, and the heteropatriarchy, that all of those kinds of oppressions that seek to undermine our solidarities in our relationships with each others. And so frameworks of resistance to me oftentimes speak to action, right? Because when we are engaged in our communities to work through and help each other out, it appears as if, and I working at the university, I'm constantly interacting with just these institutional blocks, right? Where you just try to do so much and then boom, you hit a brick wall. And I feel like what moves me to continue to act is those comportments of resistance, to say, no, this does not need to be how my life, my relationships to others are going to be defined, right? That we need to move past these challenges and brick walls. Then I know it's very difficult to do, right? It's super difficult to do, but to work in paths of resistance with each other, I think that's important as well. So.
Mahalo. I would like to cut over to Naomi at this time to share her heart through poetry. Also at this time, if there's anybody that's still on the feed that would like to share, we would love to hear your voice. And we would love to have you, share any thoughts of solidarity with the families in Atlanta, or any artistic expressions of your grief or ideas for solutions for the future.
Sea foam, born of agitation and breaking, of the water mixed with air and earth. I am at once all and none, apart but always held apart, condemned to perpetually reach but never arrive. It is a life of fleeting freedoms, to be fluid, connected, to be made of magic, to embody rebirth of the water, air, and earth. To be seen only in parts, never one, or not seen at all. Disillusioned, tossed about, dissolving, pollution and death. So I become tiny clouds that will soar across the ocean and crawl along the sandy shores. Agitation, breaking, a life of always coming and going, yearning, constantly returning to a place, to many places that will always never be ours. Too many places, never home. Constantly reaching, longing to be welcomed ashore, or to return to Mother Ocean, born again and again and again, a daughter of the air, a son of the sea. With the spirits of both, we are children of the islands of many lands, holding all the tears, the ghosts, the yearnings, all of our brokenness and all of our hopes, reaching back from the lessons of our past and re-envisioning our futures, always reaching for each other so that we might always, forever be connecting, healing, whole.
Thank you so much. I wanted to, from the bottom of my heart, thank each and every member of this panel. It was a learning experience for me. Everybody comes with such different perspective. And I think, it's important for me to engage in a forum like this where we're normalizing grieving publicly as Asian people, where we're normalizing using our voice, we're normalizing being visible, and we're normalizing coming together in dialogue and standing up for Asian women and girls. Again, thank you, Japanese American Pilgrimages, for giving us this platform. For those of you that are not familiar with me, my background is actually that of a spoken word artist. I perform under the name Katana. And so I wanted to share this poem with you that speaks a lot about my experiences with militarism in the Pacific context. You take little girls and make them believe that their life must revolve around your aim to spread seed. Well, I am worth more. I am worth more. I am worth so much more than breast of yellow-tinted flesh, dark almond-shaped eyes, and silk dress that belong to so many before me. And I refuse to buy into your lies about Asian sexuality because I know that I am worth more than the distortion of his story. Because his story knows that my vagina ain't slanted like my eyes. And his story knows that she gets no pleasure with a grown man's groin between her thighs at age 5. And his story knows that poverty pushes Thai girls into a third world red light. And his story knows that Tokyo nightclubs are filled with Filipinas who took flight from hunger's bite. So despite what he's told me, despite how he's tried to mold me, we are not hollow little China dolls with mouths and legs spread wide open, created for men to over. Simply said, we are survivors of destruction and male egotism that masterminds human trafficking and claims it fights for freedom. And I remain so proud of my sisters that are self-taught. They know that the body is a shell and that the soul can never be bought. And let me interject and say that there is no BA, MA, or PhD that would ever make me feel above my sisters who know the true struggles and strengths of femininity. And they are why, when I'm walking down Waikiki and the next group of Marines who cat calls my way, they will see me turn around and say that this is the queen of Siamese pussy. This is to be both desired and respected because I have lived 41 years of terror, tolerance, poverty, pain, and victory. And I have earned every bit of mystery, majesty, fantasy, and hardcore realness that comes with the territory of being labeled Asian woman. I'd like to now call Miss Willow Chang back up to the stream. She is going to be closing us out with freestyle Buto dance. And for those of you that may not be familiar with Buto, Buto comes out of the pain and oppression of violence on the bodies of Japanese people. So Miss Willow, when you're ready, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I just feel that it's the appropriate thing to say something prior to dancing. I want to thank everybody present who put this together. Deeply a great honor to share and to collaborate in this capacity to create dialogue. I would like to dedicate this dance to my sensei, Lore Otani. Sadly, she passed away last year. She has left a tremendous impact on me as a person and as an artist. I try to do my best to honor her through what she has taught me. The work that I will be performing to, and forgive my pronunciation, Tinsagu na nu hana. It's an Okinawan song that has its roots in, I have to breathe here. It has its roots in Confucian teaching, and it translates as to the balsam flowers. And so this flower has a stain that can be used on the fingernails to ward off evil. I will just quickly read the English translation so it gives some perspective, with the understanding that translations sometimes lose something along the way. Just as my fingernails are stained with the pigment from balsam flowers, My heart is painted with the teachings of my parents. Although the stars in the sky are countable, the teachings of my parents are not. Just as ships that run in the night are guided to safety by the North Star, I am guided by my parents, who gave birth to me and watch over me. There's no point in possessing magnificent jewelry if you don't maintain it. People who maintain their bodies will live life wonderfully. The desires of a person who lives sincerely will always run true, and as a result, she will prosper. You can do anything if you try, but if you can't, if you don't.
I wanted to be off camera, but I think that the purpose of this is to normalize Asian people being able to vocalize our grief around this tragedy in Atlanta and to center the victims. So I'm just going to be transparent with my messy makeup and mascara. Thank you, Willow. That really spoke to my na'au, that really spoke to my heart. Thank you, all of you, for the beautiful perspectives that you've shared. I hope that this is just the beginning of the ways and I think in our community, like 6 degrees of separation, we all know each other, small island, or work with people that know each other or know each other's work. But I hope that this is just the beginning of the way that we connect and could continue to drive change in the Hawaii context, as well as the national, international context. Would anybody else like to share anything?
I just want to say thank you so much for everybody who was gathered here today and for all of our panelists. We planned this event in, I think, less than 3 days, and I'm just so grateful for all of you and so amazed by this incredible meeting we've had today and all of the amazing things we've been able to discuss and all the healing we've brought. Mahalo piaha to all of you. Thank you.